Now is the time to secure a legacy of freedom. Welcome to Freedom Alive. It has become standard practice that an incoming president signs a flurry of executive orders. This allows the president to manage the federal government without action from Congress. And new presidents can, and often do, issue orders to cancel the orders of their predecessors. But there's also limits to what these orders can achieve. We really witnessed a whirlwind when President Donald Trump began his second term by signing 200 executive actions in one day. 200. And he hasn't stopped. So now he has begun to make monumental policy shifts that are already changing our nation for the better. But we can't just sit back and think everything is fine, can we? None of these are permanent, and each one can be reversed just as quickly by a future president. Joining us on this episode to discuss this is Liberty Counsel Action's policy analyst and copywriter, Abigail Forman. But first, our Freedom Alert is next. Liberty University has appealed a meritless Title VII lawsuit. In July 2023, Liberty University terminated Jonathan Zinski after he flagrantly and intentionally violated Liberty University's doctrinal statement and policies. When Zinski was hired, he acknowledged and affirmed the doctrinal statement. But as soon as his 90-day probation period expired, he revealed he had started taking female hormones 4 months before he was hired, and he wants to identify as Eleanor. Liberty University has appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals since a federal judge refused to dismiss this meritless lawsuit. Liberty University has the right under the First Amendment and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to uphold its sincere Christian religious beliefs and require its employees to do the same. Title VII exempts Liberty University from having to employ individuals who violate this doctrinal position. I'm pleased to welcome our special guest and, frankly, a colleague of mine, Abigail Forman. She is a policy analyst and copywriter for Liberty Counsel Action. She also is a former state legislator in Minnesota and also the former director of public policy for Right to Life UK in the United Kingdom. Very well versed in the area of public policy. Welcome to Freedom Alive, Abigail.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. It's an honor and privilege to be here. Really looking forward to discussing this topic with you today.
Well, it's been a whirlwind since January 2025, when President Donald Trump was sworn into office. 200 executive actions just in a short period of time, and many more that have followed afterward. I want to talk a little bit about some of these executive actions and what we need to do going forward and codifying those into law. You know, when President Joe Biden took office in 2021, he did something similar. He did a lot of executive actions. He reversed a lot of President Trump's executive positions and policies, and he did that by just signing a signature of a pen, maybe even by an auto pen. We now find out with some automatic signature. But then President Trump comes into office and he does the same thing. And many of those are very good decisions. But how do we go forward from those executive actions to making something like that permanent?
That is a great question, Matt. And the most important thing, what that needs to happen right now, is Congress needs to take action. So all of the things that Trump has done, as you alluded to, could be easily undone by a future administration. In order to prevent that, Congress needs to introduce legislation that aligns with everything Trump is doing, pass it through the process, and then Trump needs to sign those bills into law. That's the most important thing that can happen right now, to make sure that what Trump is doing is not undone. There's another reform I think that we could see happen that would really help prevent some of the political whiplash we see administration to administration, specifically reforming how presidents can use executive orders in terms of executive agreements more specifically. And that would prevent some of the political whiplash we see as well.
And so what kind of reforms would you suggest in that area?
In the area of executive agreements, this is a very specific area of executive action related to international law. I would suggest that we go back to the process that our founders intended in the Constitution, so that in order to enter a binding international agreement, in other words, a treaty, you need to get the 2/3 approval of the U.S. Senate. Right now, presidents are able to bypass that. And this is all presidents. It's both parties, and it's just increased over time. They bypass this by using executive agreements. And this is why we see a lot of political whiplash, in particular in the international arena.
So let's make it very clear for the viewers here. On the one hand, we're talking about executive orders, and that's what the president has been doing, for example, on day one, issuing executive orders, signing those. Many of those are in front of the cameras, and they make policy changes for the administrative branch. That's an executive order. You're talking beyond that with regards to executive agreements. And that's an agreement that the president signs with a foreign country and tries to bypass Congress in doing so rather than get the 2/3 vote necessary to ratify a treaty. That's what the difference is between an executive order that he signs that deals with domestic policy, but also you have these international agreements that presidents have signed to try to bind us to international agreements.
Yeah, that's right, Matt. And what we see with executive actions generally, you mentioned, it's important to distinguish. There's executive orders, executive agreements, executive proclamations, and executive memorandums. They all have a unique place, and they're all very important. And presidents are able to use all of these to implement their policy objectives.
So let's talk about some of the policy objectives specifically with the executive agreement and also something that President Donald Trump did with an order, and that is the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, he signed an executive order that we were giving notice to withdraw from the World Health Organization. Biden was threatening to sign us on to a binding agreement with the World Health Organization that would allow them to have control over our medical policies and much of our movement and activities in the United States. So now that President Trump has given notice, for example, that we want to move out of the World Health Organization, what's the next policy change that should happen with regards to Congress codifying that particular order?
Again, a great question. Because President Trump has exited the WHO, which is a great first step, we now, at least while he's in office, will not be subject to its dictates, which is phenomenal. They've done a lot of harm, as hopefully most of our viewers know. But in order to make sure that a future president, like a future President Biden, for example, another Democrat, doesn't simply re-enter the WHO, Congress needs to pass a law to codify this action. Particularly with the WHO, there's a repeal that needs to take place. So Congress needs to introduce legislation, and in fact, they already have, thankfully. There is a bill in Congress to repeal the 1948 joint resolution that gave the president the authority to enter the WHO. So if we repeal that piece of law, a future president will not be able to unilaterally enter the WHO. That's what we want to see happen. Alongside this, there are several other bills that would make sure, for example, that we stop funding the WHO and other bills like that.
At Liberty Counsel Action, you have a policy statement, quite a very detailed series of policy statements on these particular areas. Do you have a list of different kinds of executive orders that President Trump, for example, has signed, and then those kinds of things that we can codify, a list of pending legislation or legislation that should be proposed?
Yes, we do. So we put together the list of the top 20 bills in Congress that we want to make sure, top 20 executive orders that we want to see executive or congressional action taken on. And with each of those executive orders, there's several bills in Congress that we want to do this with. So, for example, there's all of the executive orders related to abortion. And then there are several bills in Congress that would need to that we would want to enact to make those executive actions permanent. Just as an example, reinstating the Mexico City policy, which is now known as the Protecting Life and Global Health Assistance.
And that would mean that there would be no funding for abortion internationally.
Correct. Yep. That's what we want to do. That's what we want to see. So yeah, we're wanting to get all of these codified so that we stop seeing the whiplash on the global stage, and domestically as well.
Yeah, I mean, the executive orders that President Donald Trump is doing are fine. They're amazing, and they are doing sweeping policy changes for the better. The problem, however, is the whiplash effect, that if you have another president come in, they just simply undo all of that, and we're back to where we were, or even worse than where we were before. So we have to codify these. Let's talk about some of the other examples of the executive orders that President Donald Trump has done that are significant policy changes that need to be placed into law. What about some of the matters regarding illegal immigration?
Some of the matters regarding illegal immigration, I think this is a phenomenal topic. On day one, Trump issued 10 executive orders alone, with multiple executive actions on the immigration issue. And following that, Congress introduced a lot of bills to codify them. So there are several bills in Congress very specific to building the wall. For example, there's a bill on finishing the wall. There's a bill on literally just called the Wall Act. And a lot of these would appropriate funds for the border wall and use different means to do so. So one of them uses COVID funds to fund the wall. Another one, my personal favorite, would close the entitlements and the loopholes in our tax law for illegal aliens and use the funds from that to fund the border wall, which I think is just a brilliant way to make sure we're getting Trump's executive actions codified into law and making sure that we enshrine them, that we don't see a future president simply undo them like Biden did when he took office in 2021.
So if someone goes to lcaction.org, that's where you could find a lot of this information, because, just somebody who's reviewing this and watching the daily news, there's a lot going on in Washington, D.C. with executive actions. There's a lot of bills that are happening. Is that the place to go to be able to find out exactly what bills are possible that are pending, and then how people can then contact their members of Congress?
Again, great question. LC Action, we will make sure that we equip everyone on that page. So we'll get all that information up and available on the top 20 executive orders and the bills associated with them, and make sure that you have the information you need to contact your congressman.
Now, there's a bill. What about the Laken-Riley Act, and what is that about?
Yeah, the Laken-Riley Act came about actually out of some tragic circumstances. There was a student in Georgia who was killed by an illegal alien, and this alien had actually been detained and then released on parole underneath the Biden administration. And so it's a bipartisan act introduced into Congress that would ensure aliens that commit crimes, particularly some of those more egregious crimes, are detained. And I think what the Laken-Riley Act shows us is that bipartisanship is still possible, that it is still possible to codify some of the common sense measures that we want to see happen. And our prayer now is just that we can see more of this, that we can see more of Congress coming together to codify common sense.
Abigail, when I was recently at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, I ran into a friend I hadn't seen in a few years, and I did not realize that she was in almost a near-death accident, head-on collision from someone who was driving at 100 miles an hour, head-on collision, an illegal alien who crossed the southern border. And she's fortunate to be alive. She had multiple surgeries, but she is alive. But this is just an example of some of the tragedy that's happening, and the Laken-Riley Act is clearly addressing some of those egregious situations that we see of people coming across the border that are not vetted, that are committing horrendous crimes in America. What about some of the DEI policies? It seems as though, every company was going towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. It seemed like a runaway train, and now all of a sudden you have President Donald Trump issuing executive orders, no DEI in his administration. And now what you're seeing is these huge corporations that seem to be just consumed by DEI. They're now backing away from DEI policies.
Yeah, and what I think that shows is that the person at the top, who the people running our country absolutely have an impact. And we want to make sure that we remember that in every election cycle. But yes, President Trump did some phenomenal work, first day in office again, on rolling back the harmful and damaging, I would say, DEI practices. Biden actually had, on his first day in office, made this a huge priority in his administration. And there was recently a study released by Fox News. Sorry, not by Fox News, but Fox News did an article on it. So you can go and find it. But they talk a lot about how damaging these policies were and how embedded they were in the federal government. Over 460 programs across 24 federal agencies, up to over $1 trillion in DEI initiatives. It's just absolutely insane. And Trump, first day, rolled this all back. So we're already seeing great improvement. And like you said, it's trickling down into the culture as well. But again, we'll just keep going back to this. In order to make sure that a future presidency doesn't simply undo all of this, we need Congress to act. There is, again, a bill in Congress that would codify President Trump's DEI actions. This is called the Dismantle DEI Act, and it would define DEI practices, and even the people that introduced it, these members of Congress, were very explicit about this act. They said this is in order to codify what President Trump has done. So it's phenomenal that we're seeing members of Congress actually take the mandate of President Trump seriously.
Well, and we need to make sure that members of both the House and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, come together to codify these common sense pieces of legislation. These are common sense, and this is the 80% of Americans. That's where 80% of Americans or so are at, I believe. Vast majority, whatever the percentage is, they are common sense policies. In fact, I remember after the tragedy with the D.C. plane crash in the Potomac that you had some individuals that are being trained as FAA traffic controllers. The classrooms were not full because of nobody wanting to be FAA traffic controllers, but because they couldn't get the quota. And if you couldn't get the quota, then they wouldn't fill the class. There were a lot of people on the waiting list, but they were of the wrong race or ethnicity or gender or whatever that didn't fit their criteria for their DEI policies. So they're taking people who are otherwise are not qualified for these very critical positions. What about some of the other issues that are also common sense? The LGBTQ, the men in women's sports or boys in women's sports.
This is one of my favorite topics in the sense that it's just so foundational to who we are as a society that, when we look at having men in women's sports, we're, in essence, this is redefining male and female, which we can't do. We know, obviously, biblically and just scientifically, biologically, there are two sexes, male and female. President Trump issued 2 executive orders that would make this the law of the land, that we only in the federal government recognize 2 sexes. Male, you have the smaller reproductive cell, and female, you have the larger reproductive cell. Very clear cut, very straightforward. In one sense, it's actually quite tragic that we even need to have this in an executive order. But here we are, and thank God for President Trump making sure that the federal government recognizes biological reality. The other order that President Trump issued is to ban men from women's sports. And so combined, these 2 executive orders serve, I think, as the perfect foundation for Congress. And again, we see several bills that have been introduced to codify these actions. Representative Nancy Mace actually has introduced 3, which I think are great. One of them particularly is just so common sense and vital, and it's called the Preventing Rape in Prisons Act. Basically, it's saying that you only have women in women's prisons, and this, again, it shouldn't be necessary, but thankfully, people like Representative Mace have introduced things to codify what President Trump is doing. Then there's the other order that we talked about on banning men from women's sports. This was introduced in the House, and it actually passed the House. Sadly, this common sense provision has not passed the Senate. And unfortunately, we might have a bit of an uphill climb on a lot of these, what most people would view as common sense orders, because the Senate, a lot of the Senate Democrats all of them, in fact, on this issue particularly, refused to break ranks. And so we need to be praying and hoping and believing and calling our senators to get them to vote for some of these common sense things.
Yeah, and so on the Senate, you have the filibuster rule. So in order to pass something, you need to first get the 60 votes of the 100 senators. And then after you get 60 votes, then you put it up for the actual vote up or down on the bill. And if you can't get the original 60 votes just to vote on it, then you never vote on it. And that's why we're having some of the issues in the Senate. But we can't give up. We have to keep on pushing forward and keep on pressing forward. Speaking of the Senate, though, there is a situation, and this is in the spending context, where you don't need 60 votes. You only need 50. You only need a majority of those that are present to vote. You only need a majority. And that's on these spending bills, particularly the budget bills. And so DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, has been uncovering all kinds of nonsensical, harmful spending. But on these particular areas, you've got a whole list of outrageous points of spending that we've done domestically and internationally, DEI, LGBTQ, and so forth and so on, that are harmful to America. You've got a list of all those. How do we now take all of those and codify it? At least I believe we have a better shot, because all we need is a majority in the Senate.
Yep. And this is where, like you say, the budget process, budget reconciliation, is a way that we can enact more permanently some of what President Trump is doing with only those 51 votes. Because I think this is my guess, that the Senate realized it would never get anything done if they didn't, at least on the budget, allow that 51 votes. So in order to codify some of these things with regard to spending, you still need to pass what is known as the Byrd Rule. So this basically, you have to prove it's not just a policy bill. I'm just going to give you an example because it's probably easier to explain this way. But a very simple bill, for example, to defund Planned Parenthood. So we would argue Planned Parenthood is, a waste of our taxpayer dollars and an egregious use of money generally. But in order to pass the Byrd Rule, you can't say we're just going to defund Planned Parenthood, because it's too like a policy. But what you can do instead is say we're going to defund Planned Parenthood and another abortion provider and expand it. I know it sounds a bit odd. It's overly complicated, to be quite honest, what can be included and not. But there are ways there in the budget process that we can more permanently enact some of what President Trump is doing, which is phenomenal. And this is, if I recall correctly, this is actually how the Democrats got Obamacare passed in the first place.
Yeah, that's how they got Obamacare passed, and it was on the eve just before Christmas. They went all the way up till almost Christmas Day in that December when they passed Obamacare in the late hours of the day. So what we have right now is a critical issue facing the country with regards to spending. Obviously, we can't keep spending the way we have been doing. We just will run out of money, and this will bring the country down to its knees, and we'll be basically servants to other countries that are holding the mortgages, if you will. But there's also a lot of spending that it doesn't matter what President Trump or any other president's doing. You've got the deep state that are spending money to do things that are harmful to America, promoting DEI in foreign countries, promoting LGBTQ theater performances and so forth, and some of these other funds. So what should people that are viewing right now want to focus on? What should they do with regards to contacting their members of Congress? And we are talking about people all over the nation. So some of these people may have members of Congress that are favorable, and some people might have members of Congress that are not favorable.
I think this is a great question. And to answer the question very specifically, you should be asking your member of Congress on the spending issue. The unique bill in Congress that would address at least a lot of it is the bill that would permanently get rid of the United States Department of International Aid, USAID. That's where a lot of this spending, you gave so many great examples, but a lot of this really awful spending is coming out of that department. And there's a bill that would just completely get rid of it for good. So if you have a member of Congress that's favorable, I would say certainly email them, call them, let them know, please, vote for this. But also, what else can you do? Because we want to keep that member in office. You can offer to make sure you're going to participate when it's time for them to be reelected, because we want to keep them in office. If your member is not favorable, this is a bit trickier. You're going to have some conversations and ask them why they are not open to common sense measures. To be quite honest, most of them are probably not going to vote for bills that are common sense. And so here's the thing. When it comes time, next election cycle, you need to be out on the ground running around for their opponent. You want to get somebody in office that's going to do the right things. And so you can be clear with your members, say, this is what I think needs to happen. Be polite, but make it clear that if they want to stay in office, they need to enact the will of the people.
Go to lcaction.org, because you can fax and you can petition members of Congress of both parties, and that will reach all the different people that are relevant to this upcoming vote on any particular issue. lcaction.org. Our guest has been Abigail Forman. She is a public policy analyst and copywriter for Liberty Counsel Action. Thank you for joining us today on Freedom Alive.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a pleasure.
Our guest, Abigail Forman, really, I think, pointed out something critically important. So many people think that all is well because President Donald Trump is issuing all these executive orders and we don't need to do anything. Well, the problem is that if that's our thinking, we will lose all the ground that we are gaining with these executive orders. President Donald Trump has done an amazing job issuing these executive orders, but that is the beginning. That's the starting gun in the race, if you will. We need to now run the race. Take that cue of these executive orders. For example, that there are two sexes, male and female. That's clearly part of his executive order, among many. But now what we need to do is take those executive orders and we need to tell our members of Congress to enact those in legislation, to codify those executive orders so that when there's a change in presidency down the road, we don't have this whiplash back and forth, that we have these executive orders permanent. And by the way, we don't need to just focus only on Congress, because some of these executive orders, they're frankly marching orders, if you will. These are templates that we can roll out on the state and local levels as well. So now is the time to take this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and make sure that we have permanent, lasting change that will continue for generations. Well, in closing, remember Romans 13, verse 1, which says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no such authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. So join us again here next time, where you'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.